En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 27 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Bogotá el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Buenas tardes para todos y todas. Soy Jessica.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Arrieta Mahul, and I'm a project coordinator for Fundación Gabo. Welcome to this, the last talk in the series of talks, Uncharted Territory for Migration, Borders, Mobility, and Integration, organized by Fundación Gabo and the International Organization for Migration, IOM. The name for this talk is People and Movement, Migration in the Caribbean. It will last 1 hour, and speakers will be Maricel Moreno from Puerto Rico, Carlos Manuel Alvarez from Cuba, and Freya Leon from Venezuela. There will be a first segment of a talk among the guest speakers, and then we will have a Q&A section. Freya, Maricel, and Carlos, welcome to this activity. Let's begin, and thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Jessica, and welcome. Hi, Freya. Hi, Maricel. Welcome to this series of talks, and I'd like to welcome you today to begin this talk with the following question. Why is there an interest in working on this topic of migration in the Caribbean and human mobility from the academic sector, as well as from the journalism field? I would like to begin by exploring why there is an interest from your realm of work. So I'd like to hand the floor over. Thank you very much, Freya, once again. And I'd like to thank Fundación Gabo and Jessica and the entire team behind making this possible. It's an honor to be here. I am not a journalist, so this is something I've been discussing as from the academic field. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I work in the United States from the field of literature and culture. I just wanted to mention that for you to know a little bit more about my perspective, where I'm coming from. As far as my interest in this topic, the truth is that this is something that came about from a young age. I grew up in Puerto Rico, as I mentioned, and I remember seeing the front cover of the newspapers. It's often that we see these stories of the vessels that have gone down with the migrants that drown or that are captured, etc. And this is something that had a strong impact on me when growing up. And after many years, I was conducting postgraduate studies, Latin American studies in the United States. I find that when we speak of borders, the main border, or almost the only border mentioned, is the border between the United States and Mexico when we speak of Latin American migration. And this makes me think, what's happening? On a daily basis, there are people trying to find ways to cross these oceans, the Caribbean Ocean and the Caribbean region, including Cubans, of course, and there's a humanitarian crisis. There are these shipwrecks, and this crisis has at times had more fatalities or fewer fatalities, but it's been ever present. So I began to research literature, since that is my field of work. I began finding documents and texts that describe this kind of phenomena. And that's where I art. So this is some of my background and where my interest began. There's something I'd like to mention, because for me, it was clear that there was this despair of people. And I remembered this because I grew up there, right? And then there was the way and Haitians were treated in Puerto Rico, and racism that was present, and anti-Blackness. So I was looking to see what could be found in literature and how the experiences of these people were being expressed. They were trying to survive and reach the other side of that body of water. What I found was very different to the experience I'd found, which is the Puerto Rican society, very inhumane, versus the literature and artwork that's produced, which is looking to try and create awareness among the audience of the fact that these are people like us and the despair and situations they face when migrating. So that's some of my background, and I hand the floor over to Carlos. Thank you, Professor. Carlos, we'd like to know about your approach from the field of journalism, as well as what Professor Moreno expressed, how art can help to humanize them. So the floor is yours. My experience with this situation is very close to home. I'm from Cárdenas, which is a town in the north of Cuba, which means that it bathes in Caribbean waters. And it's facing Florida, which means that the figure of the barges and of these people migrating by sea is something very present and frequent in my lives. Perhaps some of the details I could share with you that you're also familiar with is that at the end of the 90s, there was a case that had international presence, a bilateral conflict that came about never before seen because of a migrant that was traveling by sea. And I was studying with Ilian Gonzalo, which means that this changed our lives. As children we were in those days. And the political tragedy became something we were aware of immediately and fully. This is a well-known case, but my memory is filled with people that I knew of or that I was close to who went out to the sea, and some reached the coasts of Florida, others reached neighboring coasts, and others never made it, which means that as Cuban citizens, we are very sensitive to this, especially Cubans over the last 30, 40 years, because migration by sea occurred in the 60s. As Maricel said, this has had certain moments of peaks and troughs, given moments of crisis or the pressing need to migrate. In the case of the 90s, the frequency of people taking this journey is alarming. And you could say that the reason why I write on this is because it's about creating awareness among readers of life in the Caribbean and text on this territory and these territories that share the same body of water, which is something that we have considered and explored from various disciplines. And there's an intellectual exercise that invites me to look at this place that defines me, that should define me, and that also allows me to work on my identity. First, my identity as a member of a specific culture, and then also my identity as a professional carrying out a specific task. I wrote a book called La Tribu, The Tribe, which is narrative journalistic pieces on various Cuban topics. And of course, some had to express the figure of the balsero, these barges crossing over to Florida. So there's this first story of someone that passed away when trying to cross to the United States on a raft. And in this first example, I realized that in these migratory routes, there are sometimes it's easy to think that it's a linear action from point A to point B. But once you're out in the sea, there are many different currents, and the nature of tragedy itself and the precarious conditions when embarking on a journey such as this one leads to unexpected routes and destinations for all. Deviations are very frequent. So reaching other destinations is not such a terrible outlook, given that many times you can end at the end of the ocean. This character ended up in jail in very terrible conditions. It was a center where they would receive migrants not only from the Caribbean, but also Africans that ended up there. That's a whole separate story, but they were people that had hailed from Africa, reaching the Americas, and some people are still crossing the Atlantic in very similar conditions to the conditions used for us to cross the Caribbean. So if we considered this unthinkable, I can't even imagine what it means to cross the Atlantic in barges or rafts like these. So this person ended up in Nassau, imprisoned, deported, and that's when I interviewed him in Havana. And that is where his story appears in La Tribu, this book. It's not until when I come back to address this in 2021 where in Miami, I see the case of someone that spent 13 days and they find him close to Hughes Cane, drifting, after drifting for 13 days. And he's found in an area that is considered paradise. It's a place where people love fishing and the coasts are gorgeous. So I felt it was a huge contrast in these areas where yachts are leaving and coming, belonging to citizens of Miami to have a nice day at sea. We see this clear sign of a tragedy, which is these migrants arriving after drifting for days. And of course, this comes out in the news. It's covered by all of the Latin media outlets, even America TV and the YouTubers also report on this, as well as some local outlets. And the reason, sorry, I skipped a part of the story. They find this kid and he is delirious in a state of agony, but they were able to save him and he went to a local hospital. They were able to save his life. And when he leaves the hospital, because the press has such a huge desire to be able to cover him and write stories on him. So the reason why I decided to tell his story or approach him is above all because I was profoundly uncomfortable with the re-victimization that he was suffering, the way he was being used to be able to report on his story, and the way that he was being treated by the press as if he was just something to be used and disposed of. And all of the distorted information that was being shared made me want to write about him in a different way. And I believe it's important to write about these cases in a very humane way. So that was this text that was nominated for one of the Gabo Award categories. Unfortunately, it has been read in various spaces, but this is something we can speak on later on, and what this figure of the rafters mean in this century, and everything that occurs in all these social and economic categories that surround the figure of irregular migrants in the Caribbean. Thank you, Carlos. So I'd like to go back to this topic of the Caribbean as you have described it. As you said, there are these idyllic beaches that contrast with these situations, and migrants can end up at the bottom of the ocean, and it's easy for there to be deviations as they drift along. There are also many sharks and other dangerous animals. So it can be very threatening, menacing. So this Caribbean Ocean and the migratory routes in the Caribbean, how are these researched? For example, from the academic sector, how are these migratory routes identified to be able to present this proposal of the Caribbean Ocean as a territory for exploration, as well as another side to this idyllic Caribbean paradise that we are accustomed to seeing from that perspective? Thank you. The first thing I'd like to express is that part of what my project, which was inspired by poems by the poet and writer Mayra Santos Febres, who is from Puerto Rico, awarded by People. And this led me to write this book, right? Which is currently in the process of being translated to Spanish. But it's about fighting against this idea of the Caribbean as a paradise, because in many parts of the world, especially the global north, the Caribbean is seen as this idyllic space for recreation and tourism and extraction, right? Because this is also tied to colonialism and this story that goes back centuries. So from the academia, migration in the Caribbean has, of course, been studied from varied disciplines, from anthropology to sociology, history. I mean, you can imagine almost any discipline that could study this topic. In my case, I had this desire of finding a way to see how undocumented migrants were being represented in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So many of the studies on the Caribbean and of Latin Americans in the United States focus on migration from the islands to the United States. But what I find interesting is to see how this migration was taking place between the various islands of the Caribbean. Although the United States be the end goal, it's still interesting to see how that moment, for example, in the water, the crossing, the in-between moment is being represented. And that's what I focused on, looking for texts that spoke of that stage. And then also finding connections between the various routes. It would take us hours to discuss the various routes. And of course, I will allow Carlos to speak more of the case of Cuba. But of course, I have a chapter on the balseros or the rafters and how they are represented in literature. But I'm going to focus more on the case of the Dominicans, for example, and Haitians. The role that Puerto Rico has had in this process of migration on the way to the United States, it's sort of a stepping stone on the way. Because what we see is that whether they be Haitians that are traveling by land, crossing the border to the Dominican Republic to then reach the coast, the East Coast, and from that point, take the Ayola, as it's called, to cross the canal that separates the Hispaniola island of from Puerto Rico. And Mona Island is about halfway to Puerto Rico. And Mona is part of the Puerto Rico archipelago, but it's a place that is not inhabited. It's a natural reserve, which is managed by the government. And many people try to reach the coasts of the main island of Puerto Rico directly, but many traffickers also leave those who are coming in Yola on the Mona Island, and it's an island where there is no drinking water, there are no trees, you can't survive. So the climate conditions are very harsh. And many people have died here because they have technically reached Puerto Rico, right? In quotes, because the Mona Island is part of Puerto Rico, but they leave them there. So I explore this role of Puerto Rico in this sea journey from the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico. But I also assess this process of migration. And I'd like to mention that especially after the earthquake in Haiti in the year 2010, what we found was that additional to crossing by sea, many Haitians ended up in Brazil, where they needed manual labor at that point in time, given the Olympics and the World Cup. I believe it was in the year 2014. So they were able to rebuild their lives after the earthquake in Brazil. And after this, they no longer had work. Many ended up in other countries, for example, Chile or other countries in Latin America, and they have looked for ways to travel up by land to reach the United States. And this leads us to another conversation on what's occurring in Darien, which is the border region between Colombia and Panama, which also involves traveling by boat. They travel from Colombia to Panama by sea or by water, crossing the Darien. They also go from Necoclí, I believe, in Colombia to be able to reach Panama and cross the Darien jungle to continue their journey up to the United States. So there are multiple routes. There are some routes by sea, which is what is most prevalent, I believe. But it's important to keep in mind that it's a pretty complex situation. Thank you, Professor. Carlos, in your case, what has your investigate research looked like to be able to have a idea of the migratory routes in the Caribbean and what human mobility in this region looks like? Well, I believe the reference points are very similar to what Maricel expressed. I've been reading, and not only technical texts, but also reading from the world of art. It's clear to me that the Caribbean so seductive is how, as in any territory, all postcards can sometimes be shielding the view of a territory. The way the Caribbean is a site for economic extraction, and this is sometimes hiding its other side, which is the side of the lives of those who define this and suffer through it.
Potente la imagen que viene una y otra vez
the image that we see of many, many rafters, which is when they meet with cruise ships or tourists, and when they meet up with people who are simply you could say the soulless side of the sea. There's a text that I looked up while Marisol was speaking by Frank Baez, a Dominican poet, on the Caribbean Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and it's beautiful. I believe poetry expresses things better than we ever could. And it says something like, I'd like to read it out for you. It's short. Last year, your coasts had so much algae, it seemed as though a tourist had suffered from syphilis. And I said, this looks ugly, and I wonder if it's not the end of things. But instead of sending a tsunami and erasing Miami from the map, you once again passed on your waves that came peacefully across the breadth of the coastline. I believe this is the enchanted mirror of the Caribbean. It's a place that has a tremendous variety of cultures and cultures that have a vital importance. We have the most direct route for Cuba, which is crossing the Florida Strait, which the nearest points are about 90 miles. In fact, 90 miles is a cultural and social political reference point. We know what those 90 miles mean. It's the distance that can separate you from your dreams, regardless of what those dreams end up becoming. They could easily become nightmares, or it could be the distance that separates you from your death. But it's important to also consider these alternate or secondary routes. The Darien is something that is also crossed by Cubans or Latin Americans or those that come from Asia. The Darien jungle is extremely dangerous. It's done by sea. And there are other routes as well. There's something that I have on hold because I am a great baseball fan, and many Cuban baseball players, to be able to join the professional leagues, there is a human traffic system that has been targeting Cuban athletes because these athletes are like walking banks, given how well they play and the business for this in the United States. So there is a traffic ring that takes them from Cuba, and given the embargo and other political matters between Cuba and the United States, Cubans cannot simply be hired by large teams directly the way they could be if they were from another country. So they have to go to a third country. And these third countries are generally in the Caribbean, because here there is a culture of baseball that goes way back. Specifically for these baseball athletes that are taken to Mexico or the Dominican Republic, and then they work out their residence visas, and that's when they then travel to the United States. But these routes are strange, and they usually also go to Haiti as well. And they're, of course, in the black market, illegal, but all these illegal economies have a certain aspect of legality because the legal system denies them, but also supports the process along the way. So I'm very interested in mapping these routes because I'm also very interested in speaking of the points of contact and the migratory flows within the Caribbean. Clearly, the end goal is generally the northern countries, but it's something I'm very interested in sharing, and I've done so as an editor for some journalists that have written on these baseball players that have reached the United States and that have been kidnapped by the Zeta or in the Gulf of Mexico, or have been victims of extortion, or have been forced to sign contracts, and part of these contracts are then handed over to the traffickers. They've been taken hostage, and on we could go. All and illegal economies that are under the surface of these routes. But I'm very interested in looking into this from a perspective that I believe has not been told sufficiently. And the way the press shares these stories are always following a manipulative logic, the American dream, and about people doing these for themselves, which is always the terrible, deceiving story told behind the story of sports. They kidnap their image and their political capital, saying, if he could, you could do it too. And it's always people that come from humble beginnings and families, because oftentimes this is a solution or a way to escape chronic and tragic poverty that has been established, structural poverty. And it's in that regard that if one baseball player reaches success, there are 10, 20 thousands of dead bodies along these routes that also share a part of their story. And the story that is not told is that it's a very low likelihood for success. This person made it, but there are thousands that were not able to make it. They don't have any studies, and they don't have any public policy to protect them. And this, what it does is condones the logic behind the system that currently exists. So they say, okay, this baseball player needs to plays at New York. This other player had to go through this. They went in a raft. They were kidnapped by X drug trafficking group, etc. And it looks like a incredible Hollywood story of survival. And there are some people with less talent or less luck that didn't make it through this route or that are currently suffering exploitation and human trafficking and terrible situations. So I believe that's a topic that needs to be further explored. Thank you, Carlos. And as part of what you are expressing, and it has to do with what you said earlier, and Maricel also mentioned, the opportunities present to tell a different story, the opportunities for a different kind of coverage. And Carlos, you spoke of the opportunity that exists to tell stories in a more humane way. Tell us about how you would have this more humane perspective to share these stories, and what might you recommend to others to better explore opportunities when covering these topics? I believe it's about not elevating this migratory route as the path towards success. This triumphant story is one that we often see when they share the stories of Cubans. For example, in this last case that I told you about, because it's what comes to mind, which is of this shipwreck, Julio Cesar Capote was on the shipwreck. When he arrived, it seemed as though the story had ended. Okay, you didn't die. This is a route that he didn't take on alone. A 21-year-old with 3 other boys of the same age. The other 3 died in front of him. They escaped on rafts that I don't even think could be called chalupas because they were so fragile. It's like a direct ticket to death, which makes you wonder what makes them begin this journey under those conditions. What is pushing them there? I don't know if it's because their story has been told that that's something that can be done, that might have a positive outcome and not this tragic outcome. This is something that draws my attention. But another thing that occurs is that generally the story ends when they set foot on the shore. And this comes with these false stories about having reached the land of freedom. You are now free, as though from that point forward, there will be no further tragedies in your life. And in this specific case, apart from breaking down this misinformation, which is relatively easy to do, what I understood and learned is that from this misfortune that was a part of his experience and his skin, he was never going to be able to erase that. From the point in time that this rafter had been part of a shipwreck, had been drifting for 13 days, he found sharks, etc. But the greatest enemy at sea is the sea. And he had been harmed by the sun, the salt water, hallucinations, dealing with the madness of his own mind. The trauma that was very visible at that moment on his skin, and I'm sure some of these scars will never be erased. The trauma in his mind is irreversible. And this is something that was not only not managed by the press, but I also felt it was accentuated given the type of violence he faced when he reached the shore. No kind of psychological support or any kind of care given the traumatic experience he had lived. So none of his interactions were taking into account this reality he had experienced. You're dealing with a person, not just with a news article. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And it's also important to keep in mind what some of the immediate responses there should be. I believe it's completely immoral and irrespectful and irresponsible to say that he had triumphed just because he had reached the shore. When speaking with him, it was clear that was not possible. So this is what I try to speak to when I cover or write on these topics. The rafter is the social figure that upholds the tragedy of Cuban exile, as well as a story of survival, which is backed by this figure, which is mostly poor Cubans. So the rafter is not someone that usually has, because Cuba has social classes and they are increasingly evident. So usually these are not people that have access to a visa or applying to a job or a course and being able to escape the Russian roulette, which is the ocean. Generally, those who are forced to travel by sea are people who have been impacted by poverty from the day they were born, structural poverty. And then when in exile, they continue having this reality of social classes because they are marginalized, discriminated. And one of the most terrible sentences that we hear today is the following. When someone's here in the United States, a Cuban is here and has been here for X amount of time and follows certain standards which are not understood as what Americans would do, which would be to try to adapt to this situation. They say, this person has not yet disembarked from the raft. That's generally how they see these people within these class and economic pretensions while they are profiting from their reality when sharing this reality of an entire community. So this symbolic political violence is something that I'm interested in sharing and exploring. Thank you, Carlos. From your experience, tell me about how you incorporate this invitation to a new narrative, or the options that open up when we have the opportunity of sharing these accounts from a different perspective. First of all, I'd like to just comment on what Carlos expressed. I think it's important to highlight that in these cases, many people say, well, it was their decision. So they're the ones that, signed on to that, and it's their fault. But this perspective erases the systemic structural violence that exists in their countries, given the classism and anti-Negroism, which have not allowed these people to have the opportunities required to be able to survive and have a life with dignity in the place of their birth. So this is part of the issue. In some cases, it has to do with political persecution. In other cases, it has to do with migration due to climate change, which I believe we will be discussing soon, or due to natural disasters. So there are a variety of causes, but I just want to highlight this idea of structural violence that is underlying these situations, because it's easy to say this is an individual decision and the government or the community does not necessarily need to take responsibility for this. When it comes to literature and a great deal of the art that I examine in my book, I discuss another point that Carlos raised, which I found very interesting, and it's what happens when they arrive. In the case of migration through Puerto Rico, sometimes people are left stuck, so to speak, in Puerto Rico, especially after the September 11th attacks in the year 2001. It became more difficult for people to be able to travel by plane to the United States. And here I'm speaking of Dominicans with forged documents, etc. So it makes it much more difficult for people to, many people end up staying in Puerto Rico, even though that was not their initial plan as for a final destination. So what I'm trying to say with this is that in the literature on Latin Americans in the United States, we find that they're constantly fighting against this myth of the American dream. I know this is something that has been explored and discussed for decades now, but when it comes to the pieces that I have been examining in my book, in many cases, what prevails is the idea of these pieces or this artwork serving as a warning to those who are considering launching out and risking their lives by boarding these vessels, the Yola boats in the case of the Dominican Republic, or the rafts. These are not vessels or boats that have been built to be able to successfully conduct a trip such as these, especially when it comes to the Mona Canal, which is considered one of the most dangerous ones in the world, because the Caribbean Sea meets the Atlantic Ocean. So the currents here are really, really, really difficult to navigate through. And part of what I have looked into, what we see, for example, Mayra Santos Febre's poetry that I mentioned earlier, boat people, that's just an example, but the idea of a shipwreck as the greatest likelihood or possible outcome. And this is something that a Puerto Rican has said, right? But there are many other pieces in the case of Cuba, the Dominican Republic. For example, also when considering the work of the Cuban artist Sandra Ramos, for example, who has many artworks from the year 1994, which is the raft crisis. And many of these works have to do with the rafts at the bottom of the ocean and the sharks. So this kind of artistic work serves as a warning, but apart from being a warning, because there are so many bodies that have ended up at the bottom of the ocean, these bodies cannot be recovered. So when I read this art, it's also a way to commemorate and remember these people in some way, to make it known that these lives have been lost. And I'd like to repeat that it's not something new, because many of these artworks also speak to the intermediate passage. So they also connect the days of slavery to these new conditions that exist. So I believe there is a lot that must be explored. There's a lot of art on this. For example, I didn't know of Carlos's work, and now I am utterly obsessed with reading everything that you have written on this topic. And I'm confident that there are many other people with interesting things to share. Do you know of Leiva's work? He's from the 90s. Yes. One of his pieces is something I connect with, Ovejas. But in any case, there's so much to be explored, and this is a topic that requires much more attention than the attention it has received thus far. It has been forgotten or hidden because the media is not covering this the way it should be covered in the various countries. So it's something that has been hidden, made invisible for many reasons. And I believe art and, of course, a journalism can help us open many people's eyes to this kind of migration and the routes that exist. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Professor. I'd like to begin to wrap up. We have room for one last question among you two, and I believe there is a very sensitive topic here that, I mean, there's a lot, right? But it has to do with just how vulnerable these territories are to climate change. It is expected that there will be a great deal of migration given the consequences of climate change in this region. So this is an additional perspective that must be considered, and a responsibility for journalists and those who are covering these stories. And I thought of Carlos when he spoke of the psychological support required for people who arrive, as well as the motivation people have when they decide to leave these territories. And so there's something that I believe we need to explore, which is, given the crisis and the impact of climate change, that's something we haven't yet explored, but something that will have a significant impact in the future. So I just wanted to ask you if you've had a chance to explore this in your work, or if you've encountered accounts expressing how the situation will be even more perilous in the future because of climate change. And with this, we wrap up this segment and we'll receive some questions from the attendees.
Carlos, o quién quiere?
Carlos, or who will speak? You can go ahead. Climate change is certainly becoming something ever present in literature on Latin Americans in the United States. I'm thinking about Rita Indiana Hernandez's work, for example, and Juno Diaz's work as well. He writes on this topic. But there's also visual art installations. The first piece that I examine in the book is a Dominican's piece. Unfortunately, Tony Capellan passed away, and the name for this piece is Mar Caribe, the Caribbean Sea. And it's basically a bunch of flip-flops that he collected on the beaches of Santo Domingo. All the different colors, the Caribbean colors, that's why he calls the Caribbean Sea. But this also speaks to the situation of garbage and all of that. But when you look at the flip-flops, instead of So you see that these straps on the flip-flops are made of barbed wire. So it's a metaphor to the Caribbean as a border, right? A border that cannot be crossed because the barbed wire is not allowing the crossing. So in his piece, or much of his work has to do with climate change and there are many other examples. I could give many examples here. It's something that is no doubt present today. There's a Puerto Rican's piece inspired on the Maria hurricane, and it's basically a Yola boat filled with Puerto Ricans. And this Yola boat is in the middle of the city, but the city is flooded. So it's interesting because Puerto Ricans usually, or we never leave because we are a US colony, and because of citizenship, we always go to the States by plane, right? We don't need to run these kind of risks, but it speaks to how climate change is also making Puerto Ricans have to leave Puerto Rico in these emergency situations because after the Hurricane Maria, there was mass migration. So I'll stop there because I know we're short on time, but there's a lot that I could mention on this topic. Thank you, Professor. Carlos, would you like to add anything? No, I'm good. Okay. In that case, thank you very much. I'm now going to hand the floor back to Jessica, who will tell us what questions we've received from the attendees for you. Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you, Professor Moreno. Okay, we have a question which is, what recommendations or advice could you give to those who are interested in covering migration? Well, I believe that this is something that we have been speaking about indirectly, speaking of the various perspectives and methods. I'm very interested in focusing on the human aspect of the migrant, but I believe it's of vital importance when covering this topic specifically and any topic more broadly to cover this territory from as many different perspectives as possible. For example, the idea of journalism covering a social situation, specifically only being done from a technical perspective based on information and data, is, in my opinion, completely the wrong way to go about it. And it brings to many mistakes when discourses being put together. Professor Maricel spoke of her perspective, which is multidisciplinary, from the world of art, literature, and her research. And generally, journalists believe these are perspectives that are outside of their scope. But I am immensely interested when I speak of these migratory routes and establishing this information on the Caribbean to see the work of literary work and the work of artists and others, because it's this sensitivity and this awareness that allows us to be able to cover specific accounts and situations from a perspective that is not as limited, right? But rather with this deeper understanding this situation or episode as part of a broader social and historic phenomena. I believe this is of vital importance. Thank you, Carlos. Maricel? Well, I am not a journalist, so I'm afraid my opinion might not be as valid, but I completely agree with Carlos that limiting ourselves to statistics and figures is no doubt not the way to go about it. Of course, I'm not saying that that's not important. Absolutely not. But it's important to also incorporate that personal perspective and to speak with people the way he has and asking questions on the why, the how, and be able to have these more personal accounts that help the readers or the audience to better understand what is happening and the experiences of those who have been able to survive these crossings. And it's also about researching or investigating governments. Why is this happening? Because again, and I repeat, this is a structural problem. There are many stakeholders involved, many layers of people involved in all of this. So we need to research this much more, but it is probably going to require independent journalism to do this, because I don't know how useful it is to do it from a government perspective, because this could lead to problems. Thank you very much, Maricel, Freya, and Carlos. Our time is up, but I'd like to know if you have any final words that you'd like to share before saying goodbye. Thank you, Jessica. I'd just like to add to what Professor Maricel said, as well as Carlos. It's important to allow these stories to continue, because the story doesn't end when people reach the shore. There is a lot that needs to be told of what happens afterwards, or those who didn't make it, who died in the shipwreck, right? I believe there are stories that need to be told there as well as the psychological component that Carlos raised. The psychological component and the role it plays when they decide to leave on these rafts or barges, as well as the psychological component once they arrive. And I believe this is something we should incorporate in our journalistic projects, as well as from the artistic perspective. Thank you both for being here. And it's wonderful to have this cross-cutting approach from various disciplines and realms. So thank you both, and many thanks to Fundación Gabo for this opportunity. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Maricel. Thank you, Freya. And thank you to all those who have joined us in this series of Uncharted Territories for Migration, organized by the Gabo Foundation through a partnership with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. You can find further information on our website on our activities and calls. See you next.
En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 27 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Bogotá el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.